All right, what is up, Rock Point? How y'all doing tonight? Okay. Well, we'll get a little bit more awake here. Are we enjoying fall break? Is fall break going good? Anybody do anything fun? Wild trips? Anything? Yeah? Okay. You guys get 2 weeks, right? Okay. I love that. I love that for you guys. Well, like Alec said, my name is Dan, and I'm so excited to be here. I've known Alec. I feel like every time he introduces me, I feel like it makes it seem like I'm like 40 years old. I'm only like 25. I've known Alec, I'm only like a few years older than him. But I've known Alec since he was shorter than me, which was a very long time ago because he hit a growth spurt pretty quick in life. But I've known Alec for a very long time, and I'm always excited to be able to see what he does here. And he's just an awesome dude. So excited to be here with you guys tonight. And like Alec said, we are continuing with a series that he actually kick-started off last week called Hooked on a Feeling. And as much as I wish it was about Guardians of the Galaxy because I'm a big MCU fan, all right, it's not actually about that. What we're talking about is a man named David and the correlation that he had in some of his writings. But before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty and all the details surrounding that, I have a question to kind of kickstart this conversation tonight. And it's this. Have you ever been afraid of something? Yes. All right. Think about what that was. Maybe it was something when you were a child. Maybe it's something that you're afraid of currently, all right? But just think about it for a second, because as children, as what you guys are now, teenagers, as adults, and just as human beings in general, we don't necessarily enjoy dangerous, intimidating, scary, difficult situations and things. I don't understand the people that go to movie theaters to go watch a horror film. Like, you literally pay money to scare yourself. There's something wrong with you, all right? I don't get that. I can't do haunted houses. I know October, it's spooky season right now, all right? Cannot do that, all right? Like, I can barely watch, The Haunted Mansion, which is the most Disney Halloween movie of all time, without getting scared, all right? But the reason when it comes to these types of situations, reason is because we all have sorts of different feelings when it pertains to these difficult, hard circumstances that we have. And we've all experienced all sorts of different feelings, but in those instances, there's one in particular that kind of rises up and really fuels us to want to avoid the difficult and dangerous moments in our life. And that feeling is called fear. And whether we have wanted to or not, it's something that we have experienced at some point in our lives. So now that you kind of had a second to think about it, I want to kind of go back to that original question. Have you ever been afraid of something? I mean, as a child, maybe it was this irrational fear that you had that every time if you had a pool, I don't know why this is a thing, we live in Arizona, but I had the fear of every time I went in a pool that there would be a shark there. I'm like a 4-year-old, how's a shark magically appearing in a pool in Santan Valley? I don't know how that's to be a thing, all right? Or maybe you were just afraid of some monster that was living underneath your bed or in the closet as a child. Or as a teenager now, obviously your fears are a little bit different, all right? Maybe it's talking to that crush that you have, that guy or that gal that you're kind of interested in, and all of a sudden that becomes a little bit intimidating. It becomes a little bit terrifying. Maybe for you, some of the fear that you experience in your life revolves around tests. It revolves around tryouts. It revolves around auditions. Or maybe, if you're like me, and I'm a 25-year-old man at this point, I still do not like being at home alone, all right? Maybe if you're at home alone at night and you hear something, you start to freak out because you feel like there's something lurking out of the shadows, so you grab the nearest thing next to you, which is always a half-empty plastic water bottle, and you're I'm gonna use this as a weapon and then hide under my blanket because that's what grown people do, all right? I don't know why there's always water bottles by my bed there, all right? And that's always to be my first choice as a weapon. But you see, for me growing up, I'll be honest, I had a couple fears. I was scared of heights, still not a big fan of heights, all right? But I feel like my biggest irrational fear was escalators. Escalators. I barely trust stairs as it is, all right? Stairs are the absolute worst invention in the human race. And then some bright idiot, all right, decided to make moving stairs, all right? And it's why would you want stairs to begin with, and why would you want the stairs to move? I always think of that scene in Elf when he's stretching to go on the escalator, all right? I can't stretch or these pants will rip, all right? But, all these sorts of things. And for me, I had this fear of escalators, and I think I know where it kind of started. I was about a 4 or 5-year-old at the Chandler Mall, and they had escalators all over that mall and everything. It's an indoor mall. And I remember this one time, and I don't even know how this is possible. I wish there was security footage for me to be able to go back and look at that. But I was a 4-year-old on this escalator, and I leaned up against it, and my shirt got caught in the rail. And I thought I was gonna be eaten by an escalator. This was the end of little Daniel as we knew it. I'm gonna be the first person in human history to die because of an escalator like that, all right? And it was one of the scariest things. And so because of that, I always had these fears of escalators. But there was this moment when I was in the 3rd grade. I feel like this was kind of the peak of me being afraid of escalators. I was in the 3rd grade, and I had the opportunity to go to my very first Arizona Diamondback game. And it was super fun. And we go to Chase Field. I'm going with my friend and his family and stuff. And so, we get the tickets. They're in the nosebleeds. So there's 3 levels at the ballpark, right? There's the lower level, middle level, and then the top level, the nosebleeds is the very, very top. And so we go through security. We have the ticket and everything. I see the family start to walk ahead. And we come to the biggest escalator I've ever seen in my life. In terms of height, it goes Empire State Building and this escalator, all right? It was one of the most terrifying things to look at, and I just immediately froze. And there's a lot of people around us because it was actually when the D-backs were good, so they had fans, all right? And, sorry, all right? And, all this sort of stuff. And so, I see my friend and his family, and they're still charging ahead, and I'm frozen in my tracks looking at this afraid and feeling alone. And, I'm in 3rd grade. I'm about to cry. I'm this, little pudgy little Baymax-looking kid, alone in a sense, and I'm freaking out in this moment. And all of a sudden, I see my friend and his family. They're up at the top, and I, was just afraid. I was afraid, and I remember just seeing them. They're kind of looking around. I'm near tears at this point. And eventually, the mom they realized I was still down there. They're trying to get me to come up. They're treating me like a dog. They're hey, we'll get you popcorn. I'm no, forget popcorn, all right? I'm I want to go home. And eventually the mom came back down, and she started to kind of comfort me and everything. And she's it's all right, and we went and found an elevator and everything, but it was one of the scariest moments in my life. And for me, I was afraid when I was alone, but I was completely fine when his mom came to be with me and I didn't have to be alone anymore. And I realized something through that incredibly terrible experience in my life, that very tragic moment. I came to realize that there's something that's kind of true, that's something profound. And if you're taking notes, this will be a great thing for you to write down, all right? It's this, that when it comes to the way that we address fears like this, escalators should be illegal, all right? They should be illegal. Stairs should be illegal, escalators should be illegal. Just take an elevator, all right? Or just don't have multiple levels in buildings, all right? That's not actually what I was gonna tell you, all right? No, you see, I realized when it comes to those types of experiences and those moments in our lives, it's simply this, that isolation intensifies fear. Isolation intensifies fear. High schoolers, isn't this true? You see, haven't you experienced this in your own life? For you, just think about the phase that you had as a kid. Around kindergarten, you're 4 or 5 years old, right? When you're afraid of the dark. And you were afraid of the dark until somebody else showed up. Or until somebody else was with you. Or let's think about something recently. Your first day of high school as a freshman, right? The nerves that you had when you entered into a classroom for the first time. Or maybe you're walking into the cafeteria and you're trying to figure out where you're gonna sit or who you're gonna interact with. And it wasn't until you found your people did that feeling go away. Just come on for a second. Sometimes when we're alone with our thoughts, when it's just us and our thoughts, right? Isn't it true that anxiety and fear can rush in ways that few other people would actually understand? And because of all the difficult and the challenging and the intimidating situations and scenarios that we have faced in our lives, it's led us to have our own unique set of fears that we carry with us by ourselves throughout our lives. And because of those things, you start to feel so alone in the fear that comes with them, that when we feel afraid and we see our fear being intensified in isolation and being alone, we will do almost anything to be able to avoid that. High schoolers, isn't it true that we will do almost anything to ignore or to avoid or to be able to go around what we are afraid of most? And just for the sake of understanding today, I want us to kind of imagine something, all right? I want us to imagine that there's just this aisle right here, all right? There's just this aisle right here and that represents the road that goes through the things that we are afraid of most. It's the road that is full of the acknowledgments that we need to make, or the actions that we need to take that would actually cause us to be able to take our fear and our anxieties head on. But if that's the road that actually would improve things, then why do we often, more times than not, try to take the road that goes around our fear and instead of the one that goes through it? I mean, just be honest with yourself for a second. We've experienced this in our life. I mean, if that is the road that goes through fear and takes us through the things that we are afraid of most, that we despise, that we don't want to acknowledge, that isn't true, that we'll make an effort to be able to go around it all to be able to make an easier path. We find ourselves going around by trying things like self-help advice, right? Or we'll surround ourselves with friends that will only say things that we want to hear. Or, we just try to be positive. We just try to put the smile on our face, right? Or, maybe we'll think happy thoughts. We'll think happy thoughts that will make it all go away forever. And we find ourselves trying to just get enough positive vibes in the entire universe because then it will all resolve itself. But then we have found ourselves walking around those fears instead of facing them. And for some of us, maybe you saw that road ahead and you started to kind of take the steps towards it. But somewhere along the line, you got distracted. You see, as you're walking towards that path, you saw something that was shining out of the corner of your eye. And it promised to make it easier. It promised to make it lighter. It promised to bring you rest and relaxation. And before you knew it, you found yourself sitting in a chair that promised to make the road through your fear a little bit easier. Maybe you found yourself sitting because you were involved in an unhealthy friendship or a relationship. Maybe it was an addiction that you had or some use of substances. Maybe you found yourself surrounding yourself in your identity where you had popularity. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was success. For some reason, you found yourself getting stuck. And for some of us, we see that path. We don't try to go around it. We try to go over it. And you try to take the high road of what ifs. And you try to go above or over your fears that you have. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that we attempt to go around the things that we are afraid of most. And I think in a room this size, there's a good amount of us that are experiencing some mixture of that right now in our lives where we know someone that is. And in fact, fear is just at an all-time high right now within our culture, especially with 13 to 18-year-olds. You see, anxiety, depression, suicide, well, those are all rising at historic levels within our society. And I believe so much of it is caused because we have tried to take the road that goes around our fears. We tried to take the road that goes over it. We tried to take the road that goes around it. We tried to take the road that avoids it all. And we've tried at all costs to be able to avoid the one that goes through it. The one that is messy. The one that is difficult. The one that is hard. The one that is dangerous. We have tried to go around it at all costs. And what we have come to realize on this journey, on these roads, around the things that we're afraid of most, is that the road around our fear, well, it's full of false hopes. And if the road around our fear keeps leading us to places that we don't want to go, and it leads us actually in the exact opposite direction of the life that we would hope and long for, then what road will lead us to the life that we actually want to be able to live? And if we were actually able to find the answer to that question, would we even be willing to go down that road? You see, because here's the thing. There is a road, but it's not an easy road. It's actually an incredibly difficult and dangerous road. But the good news is this, that thankfully we don't have to figure out where this road is on our own. You see, in fact, a few thousand years ago, there was this ancient author, warrior, king named David. And you see, David, he wrote something about the road that we can take to the life that we want to live and that we want to experience. He wrote about this in a psalm. And if you were to open up your Bible, there's two testaments. There's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament. The New Testament is all about Jesus and all the great things about that. But in the Old Testament, you'll find there's this giant book, this giant collection called Psalms. And what a psalm is that they're a collection of songs or poetry. And a lot of them were actually written by this man named David, this King David. And here's what you need to know about David's life. He's one of the most interesting men within the Bible. You see, he was a shepherd at one point. As a boy, he was a shepherd. He would watch after, he was the youngest of 8 sons. He would watch after his father's sheep and everything. He would take care of them, and that was his whole livelihood. He spent a lot of time alone. And at one point, he got promoted from shepherd to messenger, because at this time, there was a lot of conflict, political conflict going on between different nations and stuff like that. And so his brothers were off serving in the Israelite army, and so he kind of became the messenger between home and where his older brothers were. And so he becomes messenger at this point. And from there, he becomes the folk hero that we know David as, David and Goliath. The terms that we use all the time, and he literally defeated a giant because no one else would go up against this literal giant, and he defeated it, and he became a folk hero that we still talk about and reference as sports references, or all these different types of references to this day in 2021. Well, you think with a story like that, it would just be happy ending afterwards. Well, you see, he turned from folk hero to then wrongly accused criminal, where he was being chased down for his life. And then from there, he became the king of Israel. You see, David was one of the most prolific people, not just within the Bible, but within history. And what's so fascinating about David is that he also had plenty of things to be afraid about in his life. I mean, at one point, it talks about when he was caring after his father's sheep, there was literal lions and bears that would attack his flock of sheep as a boy. I don't know about you, if I saw a lion or a bear, I would be playing dead in that. I'd be like, take the sheep, boy. All right, I ain't dealing with this. But David had to deal with that. And there was another point where, like I said, he was running from his life. It was because the psychotic king, King Saul, was literally chasing after him, was trying to hunt him down and kill him. And then in another moment in David's life, he had an estranged son that was trying to do the same thing. And then another point, David had to be afraid because he had an illegitimate child with another man's wife. So David has all sorts of things to be afraid of throughout his life. But you see, towards the end of his life, and all the things that he dealt with in his life, all the good moments and all the low moments, you see, he wrote something about the way that he walked through his fear. You see, it's pretty remarkable, but not only that, it's extremely beneficial for us to hear today. And if you have your Bible, you can turn there. It's in Psalms 23. If not, it'll be right up on the screen. But you see, in Psalm 23, this is one of the most famous Psalms in history. David writes this, verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I want to pause there real quick. I read this and I go be like, whoa. I'm just talking about what I'm afraid of, David. You're over here talking about the valley of the shadow of death. All right? I don't know if that's just poetry. You're just trying to fluff it up a little bit. I don't know. That's the road I do not want to go down. I want to live life. I don't want to go through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the whole road that I've been trying to avoid my entire life. And you see, when David's writing about this, when he's writing about the valley of the shadow of death, he's talking about the valley of the deepest and darkest fears that you and I hold on to. And he's saying yeah, there's actually a way. There's a dark and dangerous and a difficult path, but there is a way that we can go through it. And it's very clear what David is saying is that there is a way through our fears, that we don't have to avoid them. And he's saying, look, I know it sounds intimidating. I know it sounds difficult, and I know it seems scary, but you see that path that goes through the things that you are afraid of most, well, you can actually start to head down it. And David goes, but before you get too far, I want to add something to that. And this is what David continues to write. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So David's over here, he's telling us to start walking down that path. And to be honest, this is the part where I have the hardest time. I have the hardest time with this part because I feel like it contradicts itself. You see, because for me, I look at this path. I look at this path through my fear of all the things that I've been trying to avoid my entire life. All the insecurities that I hold on to, all the things that scare me, the things that I've tried to tuck down, I've tried to shove it into closets or hide it underneath my bed, right? And I've tried to ignore it, and I tried to get around for as long as I could remember. And David is over here writing that not only can I go through them, but if I go through them, I don't have to be afraid. And I hear that, and I just believe, like, how's that true? Like, there's no way that can be true. I mean, how many of us have been at that exact place in our lives? Maybe we know the steps that we need to take down that path. Or maybe we actually started to take those steps by talking to a friend, by talking to a community leader, by talking to a mentor, a teacher, a parent. Or maybe, we actually just started to kind of process what some of this looks like in our lives. But it felt as we started to take the steps towards that path, through our deepest and our darkest fears, we started to hear all the things that were hiding in the shadows on that path. Things like this, that you can't do this. It's not worth it. You are not worth it. Life's not worth it. You will never be okay. You can't do it. And you see, when we start to try to walk this path alone, we already know that the isolation intensifies fear. So we find ourselves trying to go down this path. And it becomes too difficult. It becomes too hard. It becomes too challenging because the reality is that you and I cannot overcome our fears on our own. So I look at this and I ask, David, how'd you do it? How'd you do this? You're saying that we can walk through the valley of the things that we fear the most, and that we will fear no evil. But if we're honest, that seems like a fairy tale. That seems nearly impossible. Well, David didn't stop there. This is what he writes. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil for you, for God is with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. I love this imagery here. You see, because David is telling us to start walking. And is using the imagery that he was so familiar with in his life and that so many people were familiar with in that time period as well. He's using the imagery of describing God as our shepherd. You see, the rod was a tool that was used by the shepherd to defend sheep from predators that tried to attack, that were lurking in the shadows, just waiting to pounce on whoever crossed their path. So in this moment, he's describing the rod as representing God's protection. And when we begin to walk through the valley of the things that we fear the most, he's saying God will protect us and will bring us comfort. And the second thing he describes is this. He said the staff. The staff, well, that represents direction. You see, because the shepherd would actually use the staff to be able to pull in a sheep that was starting to go a little bit astray from everything else. He would pull it in a little bit and to make sure that they stayed on that path. Or at times he would just pull in that sheep because he knew that sheep just needed a little bit extra love and comfort and just knowing that it had worth. So David in this moment, he's going, look, I get it. I know that path. I know it's hard. I know you don't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. But when I discovered is that when I took the steps to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, through the things that I was afraid of in my life, well, God was with me. His direction and his protection were guiding me and caring for me and comforting me the entire way. Now, I understand for some of you in the room, you might be thinking like, how's this true? You might be a little skeptical about this because you're like, that sounds great in theory. But how am I supposed to just go down this path just because God is with me? Like, that's not enough for me to start taking steps down that path. Like, if you're anything like me, anytime I go do something, like, I like to prepare a lot for things, like whether it's road trips or things like that, I like to be prepared. So could you just, like David, like, could you just prepare me a little bit better? Like, what's the end goal of this? What's the end game of me going down that path through the valley of the things I'm afraid of? Well, David doesn't stop there. He says in the next verse, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and grace should follow me all the days of my life, and I should dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Wait, what? David, like that, no, that's no, like, I read this and I think we just started on this path through the valley of the shadow of death. And if we just continue to walk on this path, what are we going to realize? We're to realize, and what we're to experience is this feast that God has prepared for us before I even know it. I think there's no way. There's no way. It's way too soon to enjoy God's blessing, to enjoy his goodness, to enjoy his love, to enjoy his mercy, to enjoy his care and his comfort. For me, I just look at it and be like, I'm not good enough yet. I'm not fixed yet. I still have a lot more to be able to deal with. I can still hear things shouting at me through the shadows on that path. There's no way. But what God says is this. We go through that path, and he just says, just sit down. Actually, just come and pull up a chair right next to me. Sit down with me. You see, you have to be exhausted. You have to be exhausted from doing my job all those days or weeks or maybe months or years. He's just saying, enjoy that feast. He's like, I know it was a little sooner than you were expecting it. I know that it's been difficult. I know it's been challenging. I know it's been dark, but here's the thing. I've directed you. And I have protected you through those difficult steps to bring you to this. So just enjoy. You know, before we know it, we realize something. When we walk that dark and difficult path, not alone, but with God, we realize that the road through fear leads to full life. The road through fear leads to full life. The road that we have been trying to walk around, the one that we've been trying to ignore, the one that we are trying to go over or around it and just trying to avoid our entire lives is actually the road that is going to lead us to the table that God has prepared for us. And what I find most fascinating about this passage is that David actually didn't stop describing what God has in store for us. In fact, some of you may have noticed that I actually skipped the first part of this very famous psalm. And I think unless we break it up and we start to put it back together, it actually doesn't make a ton of sense, because David describes all of these good things. And right in the middle of it, he talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. But what we have to realize is that when we walk through that valley, we can experience the rest of those things that David is writing about. In fact, the first couple verses in the psalm start like this. It said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." It's because of this that I can trust that this is true. It's because of this that we can trust that this is true. Because here's the thing, that feast is actually set. And it's just waiting for us. Because it's not our reputation that's on the line in all this. You see, it's God's reputation that's on the line. And he has always proven to be able to come through on what he promises to me and you. So, high schoolers, I know that this path is difficult. I know it can be incredibly hard. You see, I've been experiencing this. And I've been learning firsthand over the last couple of years of my life. You see, not too long ago, I began to kind of realize that something was wrong with me. If you ask any of my friends, they would have probably said that was a long time ago they realized that, but I just realized that there was something wrong with me. All right? And I remember talking with some friends and mentors in my life that there was something wrong. And I'll be real honest when I say that I was afraid to find out. And I was afraid to start taking steps. And I just, honestly, part of me did not want to know. And so I knew, though, I could not continue to live this way. I could not continue to avoid. I could not continue to ignore or try to go over. I had to start taking the steps through it. And so for the very first time in my life, I started to go to counseling, and I started to see this incredible counselor for the very first time in my life. And we started having some conversations that, honestly, I had never really had before in my life. And I started to acknowledge some things for the very first time. And I started to take some really big steps down that path and making progress towards health. But I'll be honest, some way along the way, some way along that path, it got a little stormy. It got a little hazy. And I couldn't really see, and I felt like I lost God in that. And I felt like I began to hear voices of fear and insecurities that were lurking in the shadows, telling me that you can't do this. You're not worth it. Just go back. You're not going to be okay. And I remember that all kind of culminated in a series of kind of the first real and hopefully only ever panic attacks that I've experienced in my life. And I don't know about you, if you've ever experienced what a panic attack is like, but it kind of feels like you're dying. It feels like your heart's kind of being ripped out of your chest, and you start to shake, and it just feels like your whole body's just shutting down. And you don't know what to do. And it kind of, honestly, in a situation, it just left me wondering what was going on in all of it. And I realized that I could no longer just try to coast through with these steps that I was already taking. That I needed God's direction in it. And it was by God's grace, who was still with me, and the amazing friends and community that He had put in my life, that I did not allow myself to retreat backwards. But I continued to take the steps forward along that path. And before I knew it, because God had my hand the entire way, I arrived at a feast. I had arrived at a feast that He had prepared for me long before I could have ever asked or imagined it. He protected me day after day with His rod, and He directed me with His staff. And by using friends and counselors and situations and things that I had been afraid of my entire life to bring me to the place that He had prepared for me in the presence of my enemies. And I still heard the chirping. And honestly, they still kind of bark at me, sometimes even daily. But He goes, just enjoy. Just enjoy what I put in front of you. And when I began to taste the fruit of His goodness, it all of a sudden took things that had bothered and things that had triggered me, and they didn't seem to bother me anymore. And it was incredible to realize that the path that went through the things that I had been avoiding, the things that I had been afraid of my entire life, is actually the one that led to a feast and continues to each and every single day. So high schoolers, I'm not sure where you're at tonight. But maybe the case is that you're done trying to do this on your own. Maybe the case is that you're done trying to just avoid it. Or you're done trying to go around or over it. If that's the case, then I want to challenge you with this. I want you to ask yourself some questions, with the first one being this: whose direction are you following? Is it the direction of a person, of a process, of an influencer, of a book, maybe just some type of vibe or force within the universe that promises to lead you in the place that you really want to be in life? And for some reason, you end up never making it to the promise that's made to you. And if that's the case, what if it's God's direction you actually need in your life? And here we have to ask ourselves this follow-up question of, would we even be willing to follow his direction? And if we do, well, it leads us to the second question. Whose protection are we relying on? Is it the protection of a habit, of an addiction, of a relationship, of a friendship that promises to make life easier and to get you out of your fears, but ultimately just leaves you in dark desperation? And if that's the case, let me ask you this. What if God, although it might be scary, although it might be difficult, although it might be intimidating, although it might be hard, what if God can protect you all the way through till you arrive at your feast? And if you're here and you're ready to rely on his protection and to his direction, well, the final question is this. What's the first step you need to take for your fear? What's the first step you need to take through your fear? I mean, come on, high schoolers. We all go through things in our lives, and ultimately, we can't wait any longer. We can't wait any more days or weeks or months to take the step that we need to take. So maybe for you, it's having a conversation with a community leader tonight. Maybe it's opening up to a friend. Maybe it's just you having time alone with God, or maybe it's something bigger than that. Don't wait any longer. You see, in just a second, we're going to end this night with a song that honestly, it just paints a beautiful reminder of what it looks like to overcome this darkness because of the grace of Jesus. And as we sing, I want to challenge you to think about these questions. And imagine with me, imagine if, as scary as that road through our deepest and our darkest fears is, imagine if it's the road that leads you to the life that you have been wanting to live, the one that you have been longing for. Imagine if we choose to walk that road, not on our own, but with God, it begins to change the direction of your story and the people around you, because you have decided to deal with something that nobody around you could. Imagine if the life that you have been longing to live is actually closer than you know, and it's just on the other side of the facade of your fears. You see, for me, what I began to realize is that the things that I was afraid of most, as I started to take those steps, well, they weren't as scary as I thought they would be. And in fact, they tremble and they shatter and they crumble in the presence of an almighty and perfect God who is directing and protecting me daily, and he is directing and protecting you as well. And you can be sure of that. And when you trust it, and as you start to take that steps, you're going to find yourself arriving at your feast. So high schoolers, the path is before each and every single one of us. Will you begin to take the steps down that path? That path that goes through your deepest and darkest fears, not alone. Can't do it alone. But will you take those steps with God so that you can arrive at the feast that he already has prepared for you? Let's pray.